September 11th, 2001, was a bright and pristine day in the United States. With a crisp blue sky, the day itself seemed to symbolize the optimism and openness of the country as it entered the 21st century. Yet this optimism would be tarnished, as the date became one of the most infamous days in America's history. When we think of the images that inaugurated the 21st century, several come to mind. We've explored these previously on the channel. The image of Dylan and Eric after the Columbine massacre, and the image of the fallen sound tower from Woodstock 99. We explained how these images represented a transition in the American consciousness, the end of the transcendental values of the Christian era, to a new age of materialism, nihilism, and internal competition. Another image of the 21st century is this one, that of American 11 about to collide into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Yet the starkest image that came out of that day was this one. Called The Falling Man, it was an image taken of one of the jumpers, those trapped on the upper floors when the planes collided, forced to choose between the inferno or the sky. Though many of the images of September 11th were frightening, American broadcasters made the unanimous decision to hide the greatest horror of that day, the jumpers. Considered obscene, these images showed the last moments of these real people before they died in one of the most dehumanizing ways. After the planes crashed, jet fuel poured down the elevator shafts. Balls of fire hurtled down the shafts and erupted at their bottoms, incinerating people outside of the elevators. Those stuck above the impact sites, trapped in their offices, attempted to escape. Yet on entering the hallways, they were confronted with choking smoke or extreme heat, the burning jet fuel reaching temperatures of 1,000 Celsius or 1,800 Fahrenheit. The conditions in the offices became so overwhelming that those trapped broke all normal sense of reason. They began literally hanging from the windows of the World Trade Center, the only relief from the heat and smoke of staying inside. Newscasters in other nations, like those in Russia, portrayed the full picture of events. There, the day was uncensored, Russians viewing both the jumpers and those hanging out of the windows. The jumpers each had a choice. They could choose to inhale the smoke, sear their skin, and burn alive, or choose the relief of the open air, but with a vision of hell at the bottom. One of the most obscene ways to die. The fate of the jumpers is so explicit, it takes the victim's personhood away. The Falling Man is a vision of hell. It shows that this experience is real, that something this horrible exists in the world. The image itself comes from a larger set. The iconic image shows the man as serene, placid, and otherworldly, controlled and self-possessed, hurtling toward his doom with dispassion and dignity. When you see the full series taken by the photographer, however, you see the man's real state. The iconic image is a single frame, taken from the man's true fate of flailing in panic. I think the Falling Man elicits such terror because he communicates something existential about the human experience. Born into a world we don't understand, with the fate of death ahead of us, we're also in the man's situation, but at a slower pace. He falls from a place of higher values toward the world of the material, the ground. On learning of the attack, its mastermind, Osama bin Laden, celebrated. I wonder what this man, someone who may have worked in Windows on the Worlds, a restaurant on the 106th floor of the North Tower, did to earn this fate. How this man, who never thought of or imagined who bin Laden was in his entire life, will die in an attack he'll never know the origin of. Ultimately, the Falling Man, in a photo, created an image that turned his last moments into art. His fall is a symbol portraying the human experience. The date, September 11th, represents the dawn of the 21st century and the transition from an age of transcendental values to an age of nihilism. Witnesses at first were confused. With no rivals on the world stage, New Yorkers were incredulous the country was at war. Perhaps the crash was a result of a rogue pilot who fatally flew into the building. But 15 minutes later, the cause was clear. A second plane hit the South Tower. This was no accident, but a deliberate, coordinated attack. Elsewhere, another plane hit the Pentagon, while the fourth and final one crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Yet in the confusion and fog of war, it was difficult to follow what was happening. By the time the Air Force was scrambled, all the planes had either reached their targets or crashed. The hijackers sought three targets: the World Trade Center, a skyscraper built to house New York's financial firms, the Pentagon, the site of the Department of Defense, and the Capitol, the legislature of the United States. After the crash into the North Tower and its evacuation, people in the South Tower were given conflicting advice. Some left their offices immediately, while intercoms reassured others the issue was contained to the North Tower. Many stayed in their offices, given wrong advice. The crashes separated those on the floors above, with those on the floors below. Those beneath the sites of impact had time to flee the building, though no one yet knew the towers would collapse. Elsewhere, patched into global news, bin Laden and his acolytes followed the day with interest, celebrating its success. Meanwhile, heroic firefighters entered the burning towers, climbing to the highest floors in pursuit of others. Those trapped in the upper floors of the towers made desperate phone calls or left voicemails for their family members. Melissa Hughes, in New York for a one-day business trip, was on the 101st floor of the North Tower after the plane hit. The plane hit the 93rd to 99th floors, trapping her above the site of impact. She called her husband, leaving a loving final message and explaining the situation. James Gartenberg, a real estate broker, was trapped on the 86th floor of the North Tower. He made multiple calls, calling his wife, and then around 9:30 in the morning, patched into News Channel 7 in New York. Live on television, he recounted his state in the World Trade Center. He described the scene as unbelievable, the exits blocked and the floor filling with smoke. Surreal, listeners could hear his narration live on television, but take no action to help or save him. One idea was sending helicopters to the roofs of the towers. However, the billowing columns of smoke made a landing impossible. Kevin Cosgrove, a 46-year-old father, worked at Aon Corporation on the 105th floor of the North Tower when American 11 struck the building. At 6 minutes to 10, he called emergency services for help. He tried to remain calm, with the operator trying to pacify him, but said the situation was getting very bad. With two colleagues, he took refuge in an office on a corner of the 105th floor, right above where American 11 had impacted. Cosgrove and his colleagues would be among those forced to lean out of the tower's windows in search of air. Finally, at 10:28, while still on the phone, the tower collapsed. Cosgrove made an exclamation to God as the call cut out. Melissa Doy, on the 83rd floor of the South Tower, spoke to an operator. She shared the unbearable heat and the smoke that caused her to struggle to breathe, asking if she was going to live, and leaving one last message for her mother. On the street, paramedics responded to a woman who, having fallen from one of the towers, landed living and conscious, but with everything below her waist gone. Meanwhile, brave firefighters entered the building. As they did, they heard the sounds of bangs echoing from above. It was the sound of the jumpers, their bodies hitting the roof as people fell from higher floors. Oriel Palmer, a battalion chief, climbed all the way to the sky lobby on the 78th floor of the South Tower. There he witnessed the actual crash site of United 175. Another firefighter, Stephen Siller, was off duty on the day of the attack. He retrieved his gear and ran the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel toward the towers, a run that would be memorialized later. Meanwhile, Willis Crowther, an equities trader who worked as a volunteer firefighter, was in the South Tower when United 175 struck. After leaving a message to his mother telling her he was fine, he advanced into the tower, rescuing 18 people. Rick Rescorla, who worked for Morgan Stanley in the South Tower, ignored the order for people to stay put. He ordered an evacuation and led 2,700 people to safety. He then returned to the tower, climbing the stairs in search of others trapped on the higher floors. Palmer, Siller, Crowther, and Rescorla would all be killed when the towers fell. Others on that day were more auspicious. Brian Clark, an employee at Euro Brokers in the South Tower, was on the 84th floor when the plane hit. American 11 had slammed into floors 77 to 85. He heard the voice of Stanley Premnath, one of his colleagues, who was trapped under debris. Clark pushed through the rubble to reach him, and together they descended the stairs over the course of an hour, delayed by smoke, fire, and debris. They exited the tower to the street, only 3 minutes before the tower collapsed. A wave of ash, like from a Mayan apocalypse, spread in a wave throughout New York City. The choking air caused people to flee, taking refuge in cars or buildings where it couldn't reach them. First responders who tried to help others in the debris breathed in dangerous amounts of the polluted air. Many would go on to develop lung issues or cancer. A later controversy involved insurers failing to cover the treatments of the first responders. 9/11 was so traumatic that it was the dawn of the 24-hour news cycle. With Americans so shocked, they stayed focused on the day and its eventful time. For years after, the date would be eulogized in the media over and over, the country as a whole still struggling to process the trauma of the event. An age of innocence, security stops at airports before 9/11 were minimal. The 19 hijackers were able to board with small weapons. Cockpits were not reinforced, failing to protect pilots. The Federal Aviation Authority, the air traffic controllers, were the first alerted to the hijacking. At first, they were incredulous when the plane stopped responding. They then heard a message of one of the hijackers, broadcast to them by accident, the terrorists trying to assure the hostages to calm down, and that they would land at an airport. With President Bush missing, Vice President Cheney was forced into action. Using executive power, he scrambled the Air Force, giving them the order to shoot down any hijacked planes. Yet by the time this order was made, the planes had already hit their targets, and United 93 had already crashed in Pennsylvania. All the planes across America were ordered grounded, the fog of war making it unclear if there would be additional attacks. At the time, President Bush was at an elementary school, giving a lesson on the importance of reading to children in Sarasota, Florida. One of his advisors came in, telling him that the World Trade Center was hit and America was under attack. For a time, Bush sat in his chair, a reaction that's been repeatedly interpreted. He said he didn't want to alarm the children, while critics said he was indecisive. But I think this moment represents a very human response, an individual crossing the threshold from a time of innocence to one of horror. It seems appropriate this moment happened in an elementary school. Of all the media made about 9/11, among the most impactful is United 93. A minimalist film, it has little dialogue, instead using sound and image to tell its tale. This choice to use subtlety instills the film with a sense of solemnity and gravity. The film follows both the hijackers and the passengers. It opens showing the piety of the Mujahideen fighters, reading devotedly from their scriptures, and presenting as unassuming, lawful, and polite. Yet they viewed the American society they were in as alien and hostile to religion. Trained at American flying schools, each of the 4 teams had a pilot and 4 enforcers whose job was to control the passengers. United 93 wasn't afraid to humanize the hijackers. All but one were men in their 20s, born in developing nations, with little education, and indoctrinated into a radical belief system. The delay on United 93, which was the last of the planes to be hijacked, was caused by the doubt and anxiety felt by the hijackers. As young men who had their whole lives ahead of them, every cell of sanity in them was screaming out, rebelling against an unnatural ideology. A common trope about the hijackers is the idea of the 72 virgins, the belief being that those in Islam who die as martyrs experience this in the afterlife. Though the Quran was famous for saying heaven included sensual pleasure, the line about the virgins was from a hadith or apocryphal saying of Mohammed. Islam taught that by dying a martyr and living a life of self-denial, one could rise to this level of existence. The pilot for the United 93 hijacking was Ziad Jarrah, though the character in the film, in his age and seriousness, looks more like Mohammed Atta, the oldest of the terrorists, Atta was in his 30s and highly educated. Contrary to the film, in real life he was actually the most decisive, with American 11 being hijacked first, and the first to strike its target. An Egyptian, Atta had been educated as a construction engineer. He then studied architecture in graduate school in Hamburg, Germany. While there in the 90s, he became a part of the so-called Hamburg Cell. He would later meet bin Laden, becoming the leader of the so-called planes operation. On United 93, filled with doubt, Jarrah at last began the attack. His uncertainty and awkwardness showed the unnaturalness and schizotypy of his ideology. The enforcers drew weapons and started screaming, using fear to control the passengers. Though none of the hijackers were able to smuggle on a bomb, the enforcers pretended one was wearing a suicide vest to intimidate the passengers. Entering the cabin, the terrorists killed the pilot, and Jarrah took the controls. Having seized their plane later than their peers, the terrorists on United 93 were in a more difficult situation. Unlike the other teams, they only had 3 enforcers. Combined with their fear and uncertainty, the hijackers were unable to control all the passengers. With access to phones, the passengers gradually learned what was happening in the country. They learned there had been a series of attacks and realized they were on one of the hijacked planes. Todd Beamer, one of the passengers on United 93, was able to call and leave a final message to his family. He stayed on the phone as a result of the passengers started. The energy of the passengers was palpable. They had had enough of the terrorists and were going to revolt and kill them. One passenger had a rudimentary knowledge of flying, so the hope was between him and guidance from air traffic control, they might be able to land safely. With the largest men leading, the passengers overwhelmed the 3 20-year-old terrorists and beat them to death. Finally, the former hostages made their way to the cabin, where Jarrah had locked himself inside. Though they were able to enter and reach him, he had already abandoned the original plan, making the decision to fly the plane into the ground. The sound and fury overwhelmed everyone, sending passengers hurtling backward as the plane fell toward the ground. Finally, the passengers reached Jarrah, but by then the plane had descended too far. As the passengers tried to retake the controls, the film cuts to black, their lives, with all their dreams, plans, and ambitions, extinguished. The passengers on United 93 embody the essence of the American character. Unwilling to die as victims, they rose in rebellion, unwilling to be intimidated. After the crash, Dick Cheney acknowledged the heroism of the passengers. September 11th was a fateful day, and whether by fate or accident, had a kind of augury. The terrorists had targeted 3 symbols of the United States, buildings that represented the nation's economic, military, and political power. The results of that day are worth reflecting on. The symbol of the American Mammon, the World Trade Center, was destroyed. Similarly, the Pentagon, representing empire and American military adventurism abroad, was also struck. Yet the Capitol, a symbol of democracy and the source of the country's moral power, was spared. It's ironic this site would be violated later, but by the Americans themselves, and not an external invader. Osama bin Laden was a scion of the bin Laden family, a wealthy Saudi business clan that built its wealth in real estate. Educated in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, he was trained as a civil engineer, but had a long interest in religion. His name Osama comes from the word for lion. For his supporters, this was appropriate. His acolytes described the affluent 6'4" freedom fighter as having a fierce but peaceful countenance. Bin Laden had several wives, one even holding a doctorate. He practiced the polygamy of the Arab upper class and gave birth to a large family. At this time, Saudi Arabia was an ally of the United States, the 2 countries forming a partnership after the Second World War. Elsewhere, Israel had established itself as a state, and the Soviets recently invaded Afghanistan. Financially independent due to his inheritance, bin Laden helped fund the Mujahideen, an organization of volunteers who went to fight in Afghanistan. Composed of volunteers from all throughout the Muslim world, they made a rallying cry for freedom fighters to wage jihad against the atheist invaders. In the period after World War II, Afghanistan enjoyed an era of stability under its monarchy, Yet forces of discontent rose in the country, and after the king was overthrown, Afghanistan careened from one unstable government to another. In the 80s, the Afghan Communist Party came to power, filled with educated students, atheists, and Marxists. They had a vision of a new Afghanistan. They hoped to turn the country away from centuries of Islamic belief toward a system of secular progress, gained by joining the Soviet economic sphere. Their government was very unpopular, however, and were branded apostates. The communists would come to control just the urban centers, while the rural areas of Afghanistan defaulted back to traditional Islam. Needing help, just as South Vietnam asked the U.S. for aid, the Afghan Communist Party enlisted the help of the Soviets. Under Brezhnev, the country sent its military into Afghanistan, attempting to prop up the government. Often called the Russian Vietnam, the Russians would come to occupy a ring of the major cities and their connecting infrastructure. Meanwhile, the rest of the country viewed their regime as illegitimate. The Soviet-Afghan War would be a stalemate and result in the images of deceased young Russians returning home in body bags, similar to the American soldiers who died in Vietnam. And just as most Americans didn't know where Vietnam was, few Russians had a knowledge of Afghanistan. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the Mujahideen, who included bin Laden, were de facto allies of the United States. Fighting the Americans' enemy in the Cold War, bin Laden and his acolytes received funding from the U.S. indirectly, its funds reaching them through ISI, or the Pakistani Intelligence Service. Suicide warfare wasn't a part of Islam historically, but developed in the 80s in Lebanon and Afghanistan. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the technological gap between the Russians and the Afghans meant that the Mujahideen had little chance of fighting them in regular warfare. Turning to guerrilla war, young Afghans would make desperate attempts to fight the Soviets, often dying in the process. The sheikhs, wanting to console their families, started referring to these fighters as martyrs. As their attacks became more desperate, some went into battle with the full knowledge they would die in the process. Eventually, suicide warfare became a form of martyrdom. A quagmire, the Afghan War was one of the factors contributing to the fall of the Soviet Union. Around the same time was the Chernobyl disaster, the largest nuclear accident in history. The Soviet economy was weak and backward. They spent too much on defense to keep up with the United States, and the country was overextended, occupying satellites throughout Eastern Europe that provided little benefit. The repressive Soviet system censored criticism, and a consequence of this was internal weakness. After years of stagnation under Brezhnev, the Soviet system finally tried to reform itself under Gorbachev, but with widespread public disenchantment, the Soviet Empire collapsed instead. The collapse of the Union finally resulted in the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Islamists viewed their victory as a result of providence. By this time, bin Laden's followers had coalesced into an organization called Al-Qaeda, or the Base. The name derived from the military bases the group created in Afghanistan, as well as the idea the group was a base for righteous principles. After such a success, and with God on their side, the most radical of the Mujahideen turned their attention to the United States. Citing its support for Israel and its bases in the Middle East as a casus belli, the Islamists declared a jihad, or holy war, on the United States. A key lieutenant of bin Laden, and a brilliant mind and planner, was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM. Later apprehended by the Americans, his interviews provided a great amount of insight into Al-Qaeda, their planning, and the origins of the attack. Prior to September 11th, Al-Qaeda had launched a series of smaller attacks. The most famous of these was a prior attack on the World Trade Center that occurred in 1993, organized by the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. The scheme was to detonate a sophisticated bomb in the parking garage under the North Tower. The hope was the tower above would collapse and bring the other down with it. 2 terrorists drove a van into the garage, leaving the bomb there to detonate. Though it failed in its ambition to bring down the tower, the attack resulted in the deaths of 6 people, with others injured. The terrorists were apprehended, along with Omar Abdelrahman, the so-called blind sheikh, who was a major inspiration for bin Laden. Another attack of al-Qaeda targeted the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the bombings there killing over 200 people. Another involved a suicide attack on the USS Cole, which killed 17 sailors. Ultimately, the World Trade Center became a central target for al-Qaeda. It symbolized the decadence and materialism of the United States, which were seen as antithetical to Islam. In 2001, under direction from bin Laden and KSM, the planes operation recruited 19 hijackers, mostly young men in their 20s, breaking them into 4 teams. Each team had a pilot and 4 enforcers, whose job was to seize control of the passengers and hold them hostage. Though al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan due to the Soviet War, most of its fighters were not Afghans, but foreign volunteers. Most of the terrorists on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. This created an awkward situation after the attack, as America and Saudi Arabia have been allied together since the 1940s. The hijackers followed an austere version of Islam, favoring a life of self-denial, surrender, and sacrifice. They were devoted to the idea of sacred war, viewing the world as a Manichaean struggle between the believers and apostates. Maybe their own repressed natures contributed to the hate they felt toward the West, which, unlike them, was sexually liberated, impious, and consumerist. Declaring a new and radical form of holy war, bin Laden hoped to rouse the whole Middle East to his banner, invoking the age of the caliphs. Yet this did not occur, and instead, after 9/11, most Muslim powers offered their sympathies to the United States. Here we see the millenarian beliefs of bin Laden and the narcissism that he thought he could cause a war between the Christians and Muslims. Despite his fanaticism, bin Laden was a poor strategic thinker. Beyond the attack itself, it's unclear what his long-term objectives were. The attack was so spectacular, it turned him into an international fugitive. He had to go into hiding and could no longer lead his organization. One belief was he wanted to lure the United States into Afghanistan, where after another long, protracted war against the Islamists, it would collapse just as the Soviet Union had. When Bush visited the World Trade Center, in a few words, he inspired the first responders. With massive public support, the Bush administration began the War on Terror. Discovering bin Laden as the source of the attack, they traced him to Afghanistan. As we said, the United States was struck by al-Qaeda, a stateless entity. It had formed in Afghanistan in the 80s to oppose the Soviet invasion. Meanwhile, the Taliban were the government of Afghanistan, their name meaning the students. Many were educated in madrasas or religious schools in neighboring Pakistan. During the 1990s, after the Soviet invasion, Afghanistan devolved into a brutal civil war. Different warlords vied for control until the Taliban united the country. Unified by traditional Islam, they brought a form of stability after all the previous years of turmoil. Al-Qaeda changed into a radical cult, and after the collapse of communism, turned their attention to the United States. Grateful for Al-Qaeda's help against the Soviets, the Taliban allowed a non-state entity to operate within its borders. The Americans sent an ultimatum to the Taliban: either hand over bin Laden or face invasion. With the Taliban defiant, the Bush administration had its answer. On October 7th, less than a month after 9/11, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. This would inaugurate America's longest war, lasting 20 years from 2001 to 2021. When the U.S. entered Afghanistan, the country was technically still in a civil war. Though the Taliban controlled most of the country, there was still a vestige from its prior era of turmoil, an exclave of rebels called the Northern Alliance. Ominously, just 2 days before September 11th, the leader of the Northern Alliance, Ahmed Shah Massoud, called the Lion of the North, had been killed by al-Qaeda. Yet soon after the U.S. invasion, the fortunes of the group would reverse. With the most advanced military in the world, the American attack began with an overwhelming aerial assault, with cruise missiles and B-2 and 52 bombers striking the infrastructure and administrative centers of the Taliban. Soon after, special forces entered the country, joining forces with the Northern Alliance. Kabul fell on November 13th, and Kandahar, actually one of the ancient Alexandrias, fell soon afterward. In late November, the Bush administration got the closest it would to capturing bin Laden. A small number of special forces had been dropped in and located bin Laden in the mountains on the border with Pakistan. Taking refuge in caves, bin Laden invoked the image of Mohammed, who himself retreated to a cave to receive his revelation. Called the Battle of Tora Bora, bin Laden would escape, ultimately fleeing into neighboring Pakistan. There he would take sanctuary for the next 10 years, outside of the U.S. occupation. During the war, the U.S. had a difficult relationship with Pakistan. The two countries had been close allies during the Cold War, yet with the rise of radical Islam, their relations became strained. As Afghanistan was landlocked, the U.S. required Pakistani assistance to access the country. Throughout the war, Pakistan played both sides. The ISI, or Pakistani Intelligence Service, was believed in particular to have sympathies for the terrorists. A cause was the disputed border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Holding an ethnic Pashtun majority, which was the main ethnicity of Afghanistan, for years Pakistan supported radical Islamists in an effort to pacify the population. As a part of the War on Terror, the Bush administration authorized a massive expansion of the country's internal intelligence capabilities. It created the Department of Homeland Security and expanded the CIA and NSA. The National Security Agency gained access to people's phone calls and emails and could read them like in a totalitarian regime. While this was initially supported by the public, over time it felt more tyrannical and intrusive and began to make people feel like their privacy was being violated. The situation invoked the line of Ben Franklin, who said those who valued security over liberty would soon find themselves deprived of both. While a tradition of liberty had long stopped the country from allowing internal surveillance, the public felt that fighting terror meant some measure of it was necessary. Yet as time went on, it felt increasingly Orwellian. The Bush administration didn't help things when it began to call critics un-American, creating the fear its surveillance infrastructure would be used to silence partisan rivals. Later, a young contractor for the NSA, Edward Snowden, would become a whistleblower. Releasing many clandestine documents, he revealed the extent of the government's surveillance. While it was a long process and would require the duration of the Obama administration for it to unfold, the intrusiveness of the surveillance, or at least the public's perception of it, became milder over time until it ceased to be a political issue. After the occupation of Afghanistan, many terrorists were detained by the United States. They were sent to black sites in Poland and Romania, before being transferred to an internment center at Guantanamo Bay. This site, which would gain an infamous reputation, was an historical concession of Cuba to the United States. It became an offshore military base that was technically outside of the American legal system. Terrorists were technically stateless actors, which put them in a unique situation legally. As soldiers, they'd be entitled to the rules of war. However, as non-state actors, they were not. Not only were many detained indefinitely, but they were subject to enhanced interrogation. These were the methods the Bush administration would use to get the terrorists to talk. These included sleep deprivation, loud music, and waterboarding. Waterboarding was said to simulate drowning and was one of the most controversial practices of the administration. Supporters felt that in such dramatic times, the ends justified the means, while detractors thought the practice violated all the ethical principles that made America great. An intellectual, Christopher Hitchens, wanted to experience waterboarding himself before he passed a judgment on it. Signing himself up for the experience, he held 2 weights in his hands while being waterboarded, dropping them to signal when he had had enough and wanted to stop. The torture having begun, Hitchens dropped the weights quickly, wanting it to stop. When asked later, he explained it was not simulated drowning, but drowning itself, the effect being the same, even if the victim's head wasn't underwater. The use of enhanced interrogation backfired in some ways. It reduced America's credibility on the world stage, and turned its inmates into martyrs who were suffering for their faith. It also resulted in unreliable information. Generally, relationship building and cultivating rapport result in more reliable information. While being tortured, victims will respond positively to leading questions, and wanting the torture to stop, tell their interrogators what they want to hear. This bad information includes what was used to justify the invasion of Iraq. A figure affirming Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction left over from the war with Iran and was opening to selling them to terrorists. During this period, the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, developed a brutal reputation. After the withdrawal of the British and French empires during decolonization, a wave of Arab nationalism spread through the newly independent countries. It promoted a course of secular development and made abortive attempts to create a pan-Arab nation. In Iraq, the Ba'ath Party came to prominence, but the country soon drifted from political pluralism to authoritarianism. After becoming president, Saddam Hussein would crush individual liberties and establish himself as dictator. After an infamous show trial, Hussein established an autocracy over Iraq, ruling through fear. He nationalized the oil industry, with energy becoming the largest source of revenue for the country. The oil was exported through a narrow artery in the south of Iraq and through the Persian Gulf before it could be sold abroad. Neighboring Iraq was Iran, which had been a U.S. ally during the rule of the Shah. In response to American imperialism, however, the country rose in an Islamic revolution. The Shah was overthrown, and Iran became a theocracy. Imagining Iran was weakened by the turmoil, Saddam invaded his neighbor, hoping to seize the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, which had a majority Arab population. Though the Iraqis had advanced weapons, the Iranians mobilized and used its larger population in human wave attacks against the invader. The war between Iraq and Iran went on for years, becoming a bloody stalemate that resembled the First World War. Finally, the war concluded, both sides accomplishing nothing. During the war, an ethnic group in Iraq, the Kurds, rose in rebellion against Saddam Hussein. In response, in one of his most infamous acts, Saddam used chemical weapons, so-called weapons of mass destruction, to suppress them. After his defeat, and still wielding an oversized military, Saddam turned his attention to the region. There, south of Iraq, was Kuwait, a small Gulf state that possessed a large reserve of oil. Saddam invaded and overran the small nation quickly, though his attack provoked worldwide attention. During this time, the father of George Bush, Bush Sr., was the president. He had been vice president under Reagan before going on to serve one term in the White House. A northerner from Massachusetts, his son Bush Jr. was born in Texas and raised in the culture of it. As president, Bush Sr. would be challenged with how to respond to Saddam's invasion. The Americans had been allied with the Gulf states since the 1940s, providing them with security and military technology in exchange for energy. With the area threatened by the rise of a dictator, the United States intervened to liberate Kuwait. From its bases in Saudi Arabia, the Americans launched a bold counterattack against Iraq, using tactics comparable to the Blitzkrieg. Combined with overwhelming air power, the Americans wiped out the Iraqi military rapidly. Yet after liberating Kuwait, Bush Sr. made the decision to not overthrow Saddam's regime. Some, including his son Bush Jr., believed this was an error. Throughout his life, Bush Jr. had always disappointed his father, and in adulthood he entered politics, hoping to earn his affection. After serving as the governor of Texas, he ran for president, running against Bill Clinton's Vice President Al Gore in 2000, and against future Secretary of State John Kerry in 2004. The election was close in 2000. Al Gore technically won the popular vote, common for Democrats in that time, but lost in the Electoral College. The deciding state was Florida, where Bush's brother Jeb Bush was actually the governor. The close vote in Florida triggered recounts, which were finally ended by the state. Due to his brother's governorship, this elicited some controversy, though a Supreme Court decision closed the case and Bush Jr. became president. Bush ran as a so-called compassionate conservative. His main policies included the No Child Left Behind Act, which expanded special education services in schools, and a massive tax cut for the wealthy. As we said, Bush Jr. was one of the critics of his father's decision to spare the Saddam Hussein regime. Around this time, a conservative think tank called the Project for a New American Century developed a concept for an interventionist foreign policy. It looked at the success of democracy and capitalism in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain. It presented a vision of the world where that success was reproduced elsewhere, countries united as free societies with a shared open market. The collapse of the Soviet Union resulted in a unipolar, American-led world. The think tank favored an adventurous foreign policy in the Middle East, supporting regime change in countries like Iraq and Iran. The idealists of this movement felt that if the United States imposed its system on the region, it would see the same outcomes it did in places like Eastern Europe. Yet the movement would encourage war and intervention, and the forcible imposition of beliefs that were foreign, alien, and impious to Islam. After the failure to capture bin Laden at Tora Bora, the Americans began to lash out at the region. Intelligence suggested that Saddam Hussein, though a secular dictator, was receptive to selling chemical weapons to terrorists. This would become the casus belli for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. At this time, the American media promoted the war to the public. Though the connection between Iraq and 9/11 confused Americans, they were willing to support the invasion as a part of the war on terror. Colin Powell, who had a reputation for integrity, was asked by the Bush administration to present their evidence to the United Nations. His arguments were accepted, and the invasion began in 2003. Given a hubristic American name, Operation Iraqi Freedom was a good memento whenever an Iraqi civilian died in the war. Similar to the first Gulf War and the invasion of Afghanistan, the Americans rapidly defeated the conventional Iraqi army and occupied the country. At home, protesters decried no blood for oil, citing Dick Cheney's former role as the CEO of energy company Halliburton. They believed the war was an imperialist grab for resources. Despite this, American energy companies would only enter Iraq starting in 2009, 6 years after the war began, and their contracts were doled out by the Iraqi government, not the American administration. Due to this, we can conclude it was confusion and emasculation over bin Laden's escape that led the Americans to invade. Saddam's sons were Uday and Qusay. Uday was a murderer and sexual predator. He beat his father's valet to death in front of a group of party guests. He interrupted a marriage ceremony, violating the bride before she could take her vows to her spouse. Despite being older, Uday was deemed too sadistic and erratic, even by his father, to be his successor. Instead, he was given a lower role, managing the company's media and athletic teams. The younger Qusay was more capable. Ruthless like his father, he was put in charge of the Iraqi military and intelligence, and was expected to be Saddam's heir. Here we see the natural tendency toward monarchy. Even the contrived secular governments of modern times, like North Korea and Iraq, default back to monarchy, the so-called natural form of government. Saddam's sons were killed in raids, and the dictator himself was found hiding in a hole in the desert. Apprehended, he was brought before an Iraqi tribunal. There he was accused of crimes against his people. One incident was the Dujail massacre, when in 1982, he ordered 148 Shias killed as a reprisal for a failed attempt to assassinate him. He was also accused of the Anfal campaign, which we referenced earlier, killing 180,000 Kurds with chemical weapons, and considered a crime against humanity. When on trial, Saddam was defiant, defending his regime and his legacy. While many found his performance ridiculous, others in Iraq admired him, deeming him a capable leader despite his brutality and cruelty. In Iraq, Saddam had maintained an infamous prison, a torture facility called Abu Ghraib. Under American administration, it seemed its dark days might be behind it. Yet during the Iraq War, the Americans themselves would use it to humiliate and torture its inmates, as though the structure itself had a malign influence. Since they were presenting themselves as a moral occupier, the revelation of what was happening there reduced the Americans' legitimacy. Saddam was ultimately a tyrant and a murderer, a leader who launched wars against Iran and Kuwait, which both resulted in defeat. On his fall, Iraqis celebrated when his statues came down, yet as time proceeded, it became clearer the benefit he provided to Iraq. Though a cruel secularist, he provided a form of stability and order, and without him to keep control, the country divided into ethnic tribalism and civil war. Iraq's parliament became a duel between its two factions, the majority Shia, who had been suppressed by the Saddam regime, and the minority Sunni, who had been the main beneficiaries of it. In 2003, Bush presided over an announcement of mission accomplished in Iraq, citing the country's military victory. Yet this failed to comprehend the challenge of occupation. The U.S. would face many attacks, like those of roadside bombs, which killed and maimed many Americans. In the period after 9/11, the different values of the Christian and Islamic worlds began to conflict. European countries, which had large amounts of Muslim immigrants, began to see issues over the idea of free speech. Islam is an aniconic religion, which means it believes it's profane to portray the divine in an image. In consequence, it developed calligraphy, or the art of elegant writing, instead. Westerners were comfortable with mocking religion, commonly criticizing Judaism and Christianity. When these practices were extended to Islam, however, it outraged Muslims who found them impious. When Westerners were attacked by radicals due to this issue, controversy was ignited. In 2004, Dutch filmmaker Theo Van Gogh began a collaboration with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Somali immigrant who wanted to portray the state of women in her home country. Eliciting anger, in November of that year, a Dutch-Moroccan terrorist stabbed and shot Van Gogh. Killing him, he used his knife to pin a bloody manifesto on his body. The attacker accused Ali of apostasy and called for a struggle against the enemies of Islam. The killing caused alarm in the Netherlands, usually known for its openness. One of the most publicized of these cases was that of the Danish cartoonist, who drew a satirical picture of Mohammed. Drawn by Kurt Westergaard in 2005, he criticized the intolerance of Islam by drawing a turban Mohammed, with a mustache that consisted of two fuses. The image became so controversial, it ignited protests across the Islamic world, and attacks on Western embassies. Though the cartoonist's office was never targeted, in 2010 he became the target of a Somali militant. Associated with a group called Al-Shabaab, an ally of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist attacked him with an axe before being arrested by the police. Charlie Hebdo, a French magazine famous for its crude comedy, garnered attention after making repeated insulting illustrations of Mohammed. In 2015, two brothers associated with Al-Qaeda in Yemen stormed the Parisian offices of a French satirical magazine. The brothers killed 12 people before being hunted down by the police. The attack caused a wave of reaction in France, which deeply valued free speech as a principle. Finally, even South Park, an American show famous for its satire, retconned an old cartoon for the new era. An old episode titled The Super Friends showed Jesus, the Buddha, and Mohammed as being superheroes, with Mohammed having the powers to fly and shoot fireballs. However, the show portrayed Mohammed as a physical person, so Trey Parker and Matt Stone decided to hide him with a question mark box. As a consequence of all these events, nationalists in the West, who thought free speech was a sacred virtue, began to grow resentful of the Muslims in their midst. Instead of assimilating, they formed exclaves, and instead of embracing Western values, they attempted to impose their external beliefs on their new countries. This led to a rise of xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment in Europe. 9/11 inaugurated a larger age of terrorism, with attacks happening outside the U.S. During Bush's presidency, Vladimir Putin came to visit him at his ranch in Texas, the two countries still holding warm relations following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia would go through its own experience with terror in 2002. A legacy of the war in Chechnya, in 2002, Chechen radicals seized control of the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow. 40 radical militants took around 900 people hostage, demanding the Russians evacuate Chechnya. Chechnya was a Muslim separatist region that during the turmoil of the 90s tried to break off from Russia. The Russians responded, which resulted in a brutal war. Russian special forces responded to the theater attack, settling on the plan of pumping gas into the building. The hope was it would incapacitate the terrorists, while also protecting the hostages. As the gas took hold, the Chechens began to fire at Russian forces outside the theater, putting hostages in front of themselves to use as shields. The Russians then entered the theater, engaging in a gun battle until the militants were killed. Most of the hostages were freed, though 100 were killed, mainly by the gas. The Russian government claimed they used a fentanyl derivative, but the exact gas they used is unknown. The attack showed the threat of terrorism existed throughout the Christian world. In 2008, India suffered an attack, which has been called the India 9/11. In the Mumbai attacks, 9 Pakistani radicals attacked several sites throughout the city of Mumbai across 3 days. Consisting of mass shootings, the terrorists struck 2 hotels, a railway station, a cafe, and a Jewish community center. Over the course of the days, they slaughtered about 170 people. The event worsened relations between Pakistan and India and increased the perception Pakistan was a supporter of terrorism. Outside of these strikes, 2 notable attacks occurred in the United States. In the period after 9/11, several letters were sent to prominent figures in the United States. The packages contained a powdered substance and a message saying glory to Allah and death to Israel. The letters contained anthrax, one of the most deadly bacteria in the world. The letters caused a wave of fear to spread throughout the United States, imagining they were sent by Al-Qaeda. Later, it was discovered the packages were sent by a troubled American scientist, not Islamic terrorists. Every year, Boston holds its annual marathon, with New England honoring the Greek victory against the Persians in antiquity. During the 26-mile run in 2013, however, explosives hidden on the sides of the road detonated, killing 3 people and maiming a large number of others. The explosives were planted by 2 brothers, Tamerlane and Zokhar Tsarnaev, 2 Chechen immigrants to the United States. The attack put the city of Boston on lockdown, not done since the time of the British. The state then initiated a manhunt for the 2 offenders. Footage of one of the bombers carrying a backpack in a crowd was their first clue to find them. In their escape, the brothers killed one Massachusetts police officer and hijacked a car. While doing so, Zokhar unintentionally killed his brother, running him over. Finally, the surviving brother was apprehended, and the state was confronted with what to do with him. This created an impasse, as the state of Massachusetts had abolished the death penalty. After extended legal deliberations, Zokhar was sentenced to death in 2015. The Bush era inspired the creation of art and music that commented on the time period. The musician Tom Waits made a song about the Iraq War called Hell Broke Loose. The title is a double entendre, referencing Jeff Luce, a veteran who committed suicide after the war. Waits creates an artful depiction of Luce's life. He shows the dehumanization of joining the army, the derealization of being sent to a foreign country, and the loss of individuality when a soldier dissolves into a regiment. Luce loses his hearing from an IED blast, takes amphetamines after the death of his friend, and dissociates during a surreal visit with the Pope. Luce had been a chef before the war, who returns from Iraq a changed person. Disabled, without savings, and having lost his mother, the veteran takes his life. While those in the elite, like the Bush administration, were unaffected, the song shows the reality of harm caused by the Iraq invasion. The musician Trent Reznor of the band 9 Inch Nails created an album during the Bush era, a concept album similar to the Downward Spiral. In year 0, he criticized the Bush administration and created a warning about the future. He imagined a dystopia where Bush's policies caused America to descend into authoritarianism. Reznor criticized how easily the population was pacified with entertainment, indifferent to what was happening politically. He explored how the administration's surveillance policies would lead to totalitarianism. One of the major songs of the album, Capital G, is a double entendre, comparing America's God of Greed with Bush's signature. Elsewhere, he predicted the rise of a new and deadly drug called opal, an aggravation of global warming, and an expansion of the war on terror with an invasion of Iran. The album included an alternate reality game. At one of Reznor's concerts, he dropped a pamphlet that linked to a website. This site had hidden content on it that led the visitor to other sites, unraveling a larger narrative. The ARG presented itself as a warning from the future, Americans trying to send a message back to prevent their dystopia from happening. Year Zero portrayed the arrival of aliens, who first appear as great fists of wrath descending from the sky. Inspired by biblical judgment, the aliens have arrived to purge humanity from the earth. They are repelled by man's selfishness and the destruction of the planet. They will cause a Manichaean apocalypse, similar to the flood. The album shows Reznor's desire for a more just world. The Bush administration failed to capture bin Laden and invaded and occupied 2 Middle Eastern countries. It imposed hubristic, morally imperialist regimes on the states it conquered, convinced if it spread its ideals, it could recreate its system elsewhere. Deriving from the tribes of the Bedouins, the Islamic world followed a clan-based system of social organization, very different from the atomized family system of the West. This difference meant that democracies would function very differently in the Islamic world as opposed to the Western one. Rather than divide over partisanship, legislatures would be divided based on tribal loyalties, like in Iraq between Shia and Sunni. This meant authoritarianism was natural to the region, a strong central power required to suppress the pathologies of its territories. Cynicism about the Iraq War and its false justification led to a conspiracy theory. It claimed 9/11 was a false flag operation done by the Bush administration against the country, that the government attacked itself to go to war with Iraq. Americans' faith in the government plummeted. The Bush administration passed massive tax cuts for the wealthy, and between this and the wars, massively expanded the country's debt. This reversed the budget surplus the country had had under Bill Clinton. Viewed as tyrannical, the Bush administration implemented an internal surveillance system, breaking many Americans' right to privacy. It called its critics un-American, inviting a comparison with McCarthyism. In an address to Congress, Bush presented the war on terror in binary terms, saying to the world and the U.S. population, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." This moral absolutism, maintained while the Bush administration was practicing enhanced interrogation, alienated the United States from many allies. While Bush's popularity surged in the nationalistic fervor that followed 9/11, when he left office, he was rated one of the country's worst presidents. The administration received its final blow as a global financial crisis broke out as Bush was leaving office, which would result in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. After 9/11, the government could have presented a vision of how it would pursue the terrorists. Instead, it overreacted, invaded 2 countries and accomplished nothing, compromised the country's morals, and began to transition toward authoritarianism. The Bush administration has a legacy of incompetence and incapability. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. He ran a campaign presenting himself as an ambitious reformer, though he'd later be given an award from the marketing industry for the most effective marketing of a campaign in history. His early presidency was spent dealing with the financial crisis, then implementing a new healthcare system. Though he made many progressive promises, he went back on his commitment to close Guantanamo Bay. Facing quagmires in Iraq and Afghanistan, he implemented troop surges to pacify the countries, which had developed insurgencies to defy the United States. Though these surges worked in the short term, the U.S. announced the dates of its troop withdrawals, which encouraged terrorists to simply stay underground and wait for the soldiers to leave. Iraq, a more urbanized and developed country than Afghanistan, adapted better to the American-imposed system. Ostensibly stable, Obama was able to order America's withdrawal from the nation. Iraq was left in a precarious state, its parliament divided between Sunni and Shia. As a series of regional rebellions broke out, called the Arab Spring, neighboring Syria descended into civil war. This conflict spilled over the border into Iraq, the Sunnis in the north defying the central government. A new group, as radical and reactionary as Al-Qaeda, called ISIS, or the Islamic State, emerged. More dangerous than Al-Qaeda, for the first time, a terrorist group controlled physical territory, which at its peak encompassed an area larger than the United Kingdom. With U.S. air power, action by the Shia militias, and the mobilization of the Kurds, ISIS was gradually beaten back and eliminated, though not before inspiring a wave of suicide attacks across Europe. In 2011, after a decade of being a fugitive, American intelligence finally located bin Laden. Following bin Laden's couriers, they identified a walled compound in Pakistan where messages were being delivered. Obama authorized an operation. Due to fears that Pakistan would tip off bin Laden, the Americans had to launch the operation without alerting their ally. In the White House, Obama and his cabinet watched in suspense. 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying a SEAL team were dropped in. One helicopter crashed, though without further incident. The SEALs proceeded into the compound, eliminating one of bin Laden's sons and then bin Laden himself. The team then retrieved a hard drive full of the terrorist documents before evacuating, taking bin Laden's corpse with them to bury him at sea. Though he campaigned on a far more ambitious platform, Obama's legacy achieved closure by eliminating bin Laden, and over time moderated the extreme policies implemented by the Bush administration. For 20 years, president after president had kicked the can down the road in Afghanistan, no one willing to take the political blow of evacuating. Finally, after 20 years, the Biden administration made the decision to leave. Afghanistan was invaded without a clear long-term objective, and once the U.S. was there, it began a long process of state building. Though they eliminated the Taliban and the country as a base of al-Qaeda's operations, when the Americans tried to impose their political system on Afghanistan, it completely failed. As we mentioned previously, Afghanistan was a traditional clan-based society where most people had less than a grade school education. With the American public intolerant of casualties, the U.S. eventually withdrew their forces to garrisons, entering the countryside only if absolutely necessary. The Americans ended up controlling the same urban ring that the Soviets had previously. The Americans ultimately created a kind of kleptocracy. With superior weapons, they were able to defeat any Afghan military. Yet despite this power, they were unable to win over the country. Instead, they bribed local warlords and created a skeleton of a national army. Equipped and structured according to a Western design, most Afghans were uninterested in service, concerned more with recreation than military discipline. One commander chose forest green uniforms because he liked their appearance, rather than the desert camouflage his soldiers needed. With the U.S. withdrawal, the government immediately collapsed, a comic event to embarrass the Americans. It showed the entire system was a fantasy, a contrivance made up to appease the United States. Those who remained loyal to the Western vision for the country were slowly eliminated. Car bombs assassinated key figures like judges, a process that gradually intimidated the rest of the population. The American evacuation proved to be just as cinematic as that from Vietnam. While they had had an excellent base in Bagram they could have evacuated from, by the time of the last planes, the base had already been shut down. Instead, the Americans were faced with an abortive exit from the airport in Kabul. With refugees swarming in to escape the Taliban, the U.S. created a security barrier to defend the site. An ISIS terrorist, at that time hostile to both the Taliban and the United States, carried out a suicide attack, killing American soldiers in the furor. Like the image of the helicopter leaving Saigon, the end of the Afghan war was also defined by images, those of Afghans grabbing onto the outsides of jets, hoping to escape with the Americans, with those who failed to let go, left falling to their deaths as the planes took off. Afghanistan is sometimes called the graveyard of empires. The Russians, British, and Americans all led expeditions to the country which failed. The British returned to India, later losing the subcontinent after the Second World War. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union occupied the country until the collapse of communism. Though the United States didn't have the same fate, it achieved little and suffered an embarrassing withdrawal. The failure in Afghanistan shows the necessity of leaders who understand realism as a principle. Hard calculations, like what benefits the country and what purpose an occupation serves, should dictate policy. The Americans failed to create an Islamic republic, wasted huge amounts of money, and lost military resources to accomplish nothing. Afghanistan is not so much a graveyard of empires, but a state on the edge of empire, occupying a space that is peripheral and lawless. Given its location, it's a place empires expand to once they've reached saturation elsewhere. Ultimately, the American invasion did have one positive legacy. Though the same Taliban regime returned to power in the country, as a result of the war and the threat of the U.S. Air Force, it would no longer be a sanctuary for terrorists. Suicide warfare is rare in history. It's usually associated with a desperate or dying empire, doing anything it can to protect itself. It's so close to destruction, it ceases to value even the lives of its own people. We see an example of it in Japan during World War II, when it sent its pilots on kamikaze missions to crash into American ships. Suicide warfare is ineffective. Each strike destroys human capital, killing the most effective people. Over time, it defeats itself. Suicide not only contradicts the human instinct to survive, it's also taboo in religion, associated with hell or mortal sin. Dante's Divine Comedy includes the forest of suicides. Those who scorn their bodies on earth are turned into gnarled trees in the afterlife. Their branches, if broken, mimic the pain of broken bones and bleed. Previously on the channel, we looked at the Columbine Massacre and discussed its perpetrators, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. We also examined Randy Stair of the Weiss Market shooting and Sung Hui Cho of the Virginia Tech Massacre. Compared with the perpetrators of 9/11, we can identify the traits of those who join a suicide cult: feelings of alienation, resentment, and sexual exclusion. If we look at the psychology of cults, we can also use it to understand the suicide bomber. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, said that when seeking new recruits, one should try to find their ruin, a deep life failing, regret, or disappointment, and exploit it. Many lack meaning and simply seek truth in a nihilistic world. A cult presents a belief system that can give a sense of moral absolutism. A cult provides a sense of community and creates a sense of an other to oppose, which unifies it. Samuel Huntington, a political scientist, presented a thesis called The Clash of Civilizations. Synthesizing a larger knowledge of history, he looked beyond individual countries to group them into communities. He called these civilizations, which are usually defined by their religions. Nellie Lahoud, a scholar who delved into the bin Laden files seized at Abbottabad, garnered several insights into bin Laden. One was that bin Laden viewed the world in civilizational terms, similar to Huntington. In a prior video, we mentioned the Bible, Quran, and Bhagavad Gita, revealed texts that lied at the basis of their culture's moral and legal systems. Each faith evolved a kind of group consciousness based on its values. The starkest civilizations were the Christian and Islamic ones. The Christian world included Europe and the Americas, while the Islamic world encompassed the Middle East. These civilizations warred frequently in history, each defining itself by its alienness to the other. Islam originates with Mohammed, a prophet from Arabia in the 7th century. After retreating to a cave in the wilderness, he had a series of revelations, said to come from the angel Gabriel. These insights later constituted the Quran. Muhammad's teaching emphasized devotion to God or Allah, the prophet emphasizing piety and continual prayer. All Muslims were expected to pray 5 times a day toward Mecca, constantly interrupting their lives to refocus on religion. Not only a spiritual teacher, Muhammad was also a political leader. After gaining followers, he was expelled from Mecca for promoting his teachings. Sent into exile in Medina, he returned later with armed followers and took the city. Muhammad presented a unitary vision for the Arabs, a way they could unite as a people. He presented a world with structure, order, and meaning, devoted to the idea of God. At the time, Persia and Byzantium were the great powers. They looked down on the Arabs, who had few accomplishments. Christianity and Judaism had begun to enter Arabia, and though illiterate, the Arabs began to tell tales from the New Testament and Torah. Yet the alienness of these scriptures, the idea they were imports from other cultures, triggered the idea that the Arabs could have their own revelation. After Muhammad's death came the question of succession. Muhammad was a unique leader as he combined the spiritual and worldly aspects of rule. This meant the caliphs, the successors to lead the empire or caliphate he established, had to fill both pious and secular roles. The four caliphs who followed Muhammad are called the Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs. They were often relatives or close companions of the Prophet, including Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. These successors were chosen by a kind of consensus, the Ummah or Islamic community coming together to choose a successor. The Rashidun presided over a massive territorial expansion, an event so fast and monumental, it seemed like a product of providence. If his revelation was wrong, why were Muhammad's followers able to conquer so much of the planet? Thus, the political sects of Islam affirmed the truth of its teaching. No one could imagine that a desert power, one consisting of roaming Bedouins, could face the two superpowers, Persia and Byzantium. Auspicious for the Arabs, the two states had been at war for decades, and in consequence had been hollowed out, demographically and financially. Under the leadership of the shrewd General Khalid, the Muslims erupted out of Arabia, following the practice of jihad or holy war. Persia was completely conquered, its Zoroastrian faith subsumed under Islam. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire lost many territories, including Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. These formerly Christian lands would become core parts of the Islamic world. The Muslims would go on to conquer Visigothic Spain, and much later the Turks would seize Anatolia, one of the death blows against Byzantium. Under the third Caliph Uthman, a member of the Umayyad tribe, the caliphate began to shift toward a more monarchical model. Uthman was accused of nepotism, appointing family members to key roles, like governors of provinces. For pious Muslims, this elicited controversy, seeming to shift the focus of the caliphate away from religion and closer to empire. Uthman was assassinated, then succeeded by Ali, a relative of Mohammed, yet this only led to more turmoil. Muawiyah, an Umayyad given a governorship by Uthman, led a rebellion against Ali. At the same time, Aisha, one of Muhammad's wives, rose in rebellion against Ali's rule. Ali's faction was ultimately defeated, and under the Umayyads, the caliphate transitioned into a more sustainable, secular dynastic model. Yet this resulted in a schism in Islam. Those who followed Muawiyah and the Umayyads became known as the Sunni, or the majority, representing the community of Islam. Meanwhile, Ali's supporters, who rejected the legitimacy of the Umayyads, formed a new sect called the Shia. Yet this schism represented greater forces. Its real origin lied in the Persian response to being conquered by the Arabs. As we explored in another video, Persian civilization dated back to 500 BC, when Cyrus the Great and his followers created one of the world's first universal empires in the Middle East. Despite falling to invaders, it eventually reappeared in the Middle Ages, emerging as a major rival to the Byzantine Empire. After the 700s, it was conquered by the Muslims. Long and accomplished, the Persians felt humiliated to be under the rule of the Arabs. This resentment led to the founding of the Shia faith. A legacy of this today is a modern proxy war in the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia and its Sunni allies competing for influence against Iran and its Shia allies. In the Middle Ages, the Islamic world enjoyed a golden age, surpassing its peers in the Christian world. Inspired by Aristotle's philosophy, the Muslims birthed great thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, and created a house of learning in Baghdad. Under Abbasid rule, the House of Wisdom compiled a library of hundreds of thousands of books, even exceeding the famous Library of Alexandria. Most of the books in the House of Wisdom were translations, mainly Greek texts that had been translated into Syriac and then Arabic. Scholars had access to Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, and the works of Hippocrates, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and Plotinus. As Aristotelian philosophy became more prominent, the thinker Al-Farabi wrote a work suggesting a new system for society. Writing in doublespeak, with one pious leader and one impious one, he suggested the devout should be allowed to practice their religion, while an intellectual elite took power in society. A dangerous book to traditionalists, he suggested that reason should displace theology as the highest governing principle for society. Al-Farabi's work elicited large amounts of controversy. In response, a mystic named Al-Ghazali wrote a work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. It attacked Al-Farabi and reasserted the truth of fundamentalist Islam. Al-Ghazali's work will be one of the most important texts in the history of Islam. With al-Farabi's principles rejected, Islam pivoted to arch conservatism. Rather than pursue a path of empirical science, society prioritized a life of piety, following Islamic law. The House of Wisdom was itself destroyed by the Mongols, and its patrons, the Abbasids, were stripped of their power. Once one of the producers of learning, this was the beginning of an insular focus in Islam, its followers devoting themselves to theology rather than developments in the outside world. Today we see the legacy of this. With a population of about 450 million speakers, only about 3,000 books are translated into Arabic each year. Comparably, the Germans, with 93 million speakers, translate about 8,000 books a year into German. This shows how a civilization can be insular or open. Assuming the existence of a personal God, Mohammed was sincere in his beliefs. He was certain that his revelations, which constituted the Quran, came from a divine source. If we review his writings, we find an interesting duality. The Quran was divided into the verses of peace and war. In the former, we see in Mohammed an idealistic mind, one that seeks an accord and unification of the world. In the latter, we see a ruthless practitioner of political realism. It's likely this combination, inspirational but material, caused Mohammed to have so much power. With a sense of divine authority, Mohammed's religion created and unified a civilization. In the early modern period rose the so-called gunpowder empires, the three Islamic states of the Ottomans, Mughals, and Safavids. Embracing modern military technology, they reasserted the power of Islam. The Ottomans in particular came to be the world's strongest empire, with its sultan even taking on the title of caliph. The Turks seized Malta from the Knights of St. John, conquered Constantinople, and occupied Greece and Hungary. They seized Syria and Egypt and reduced the North Africans into satellites. In Central Europe, they were only stopped outside the gates of Vienna and in the Mediterranean at the Battle of Lepanto, reaching a civilizational peak under Suleiman the Magnificent. After him, the Ottomans fell into stagnation and decline, though there was an attempt at reform under the Young Turks. At the end of World War I, their empire unraveled, and its territories were partitioned amongst the Allies. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq became mandates or colonies of Britain and France. Passed from empire to empire, the Arabs began to develop their own national consciousness. Finally, in the 1950s, during decolonization, the Arab states gained independence. The new states adopted forms of socialism and nationalism and made abortive attempts to unify into a pan-Arab nation. Ultimately, the Islamic world today struggles with the sense of identity. Despite the early conquests of Muhammad, no other events in history have shown their experience of providence. In a modern secular world, the Muslims are unique in retaining their piety, yet this has disconnected them from a rapidly changing world. In a previous video, we explored the life of Christ, also known as Joshua ben Joseph. We explained that despite his crucifixion, his teaching spread throughout the Mediterranean and later throughout Europe. As we explored before, Christ taught the most developed form of morality. He inverted the traditional values of strength and power and instead offered a new system based on love and compassion. Christ taught humility, voluntary poverty, love for the other, and resurrection. Supernatural, not worldly values. Having lived a hard life, his experiences of rejection became a model of excellence, suggesting that those who are martyred now triumph later. He taught that man was made in the image of God, and consequently had inherent dignity. The application of this simple idea across the ages led to the expansion of justice in Western civilization. Under Roman rule, Christians were initially persecuted. Their monotheism denied the existence of the Roman gods. Around 300, however, after the reign of Constantine, this was inverted and Christianity became the Roman religion. Around 1000, the Christian world became more militant, having lost many territories to the caliphate. The Pope contrived the idea of crusade, that if Christians went to Jerusalem and seized it, their sins would be expiated. The First Crusade proved a major success, bringing the Levant under Christian rule. This also allowed Byzantium to regain its former territories, though after a century the Muslims rebuilt and reconquered the Near East. While in the Middle Ages the Christian and Islamic worlds were remarkably similar, in the 1400s they began to diverge. The Christians went through several internal transformations until they became the modern secular civilization they are now. The Christian ethic was a great model of social organization, creating a community that sought the goods of piety, service, and devotion. Its emphasis on treating the least fortunate with the most compassion made its country stronger, not weaker. When Greek texts arrived in Italy in the 1400s, following the fall of Constantinople, a transformation was ignited called the Renaissance. Rediscovering the classics like Plato and Aristotle, Europeans began to shift to a new model of reason and humanism. Initially controversial, figures like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas argued that Plato and Aristotle were compatible with Christianity. If we compare this with the legacy of Al-Ghazali, we see how Christian theologians responded to philosophy differently from the Muslims. By the 1500s, the Catholic Church had become corrupt. It sold vouchers that forgave people sins called indulgences, and practiced simony, the selling of religious offices. As the Church became more worldly, a reform movement emerged under Martin Luther. While initially calling for reform in the Church, it soon split off into the Protestant movement. The essence of Luther's Reformation was that religion should be about an individual's personal relationship with God, a thesis that reduced institutional power. His movement also emphasized literacy, so everyone could read the Bible. Elsewhere in Spain, which had been retaken from the Moors, Teresa of Avila presented another model of religion. Embodied by her work The Inner Castle, she favored an introverted, introspective faith that focused on a prayer of quiet. In states of deep contemplation, she argued an individual could achieve a state of union between the soul and God. In the 1600s, the schism between Catholic and Protestant resulted in the 30 Years' War. During the war, the Catholics attempted to force the Protestants back into the faith. This failed, leaving the religion permanently divided. Protestantism later fragmented further, breaking into an innumerable number of sects. The war had been one of the most destructive in Europe's history. Fought mostly in Germany, some areas saw depopulations from 33 to 50%. The war had caused so much harm and accomplished so little that it forever ended fanaticism in Christianity. Moving away from the persecution of heretics, the Christians began to accept a diversity of beliefs. This then led to the scientific revolution, pioneered by figures like Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, Spinoza, and Descartes. Later, the Enlightenment of the 18th century brought the empirical perspective further. Imagining God as a divine watchmaker, they viewed him as the source of the mechanistic principles of the universe. Teaching the ideals of free thought and toleration, the Enlightenment also said that the subjects of kings should have a say in how to govern their nations. Finally, the Industrial Revolution was the start of a new age of materialism. With new technology, resources could rapidly be acquired, transformed into goods, and transported to markets for consumers. The Christians had shifted from a spiritual to a material civilization. Ultimately, Al-Farabi proposed a path in Islam that could have been the beginning of a material civilization. However, the rejection of his philosophy caused the Islamic world to proceed in another direction. Today we see the results of this in the culture's religious conservatism. Meanwhile, the Christians went through several internal transformations. Through their dynamism and protean nature, they adapted and changed over time into the modern archetype of a material civilization. We've looked at many images that inaugurated the 21st century. One we haven't seen before is this one. This painting, titled Number 5, was made by Jackson Pollock in 1948. The painting was made only a short time after the Holocaust, which caused most people in Europe to shift toward atheism. While Number 5 may confuse the reader, it makes more sense if given a title. I can do anything. What the painting does is express nihilistic freedom. Freed from service to God or a greater moral arbiter, humans are liberated. Pollock breaks the principles of art, the ideas of form, value, and composition, to show the idea of radical freedom. Yet the painting also contains a theme of horror. Recalling the Holocaust, it shows a vision of the future when man is radically free. 9/11 ultimately represents the collision of two forms of nihilism, the mammon of the West, embodied by the towers, and a suicidal vision of Islam. One of the boldest, most cinematic acts of terror, 9/11 resulted in 3,000 deaths, the highest of any terrorist attack in history. The day retains a mystique, a consequence of the unique horror of that day. It ushered in an era of wars that accomplished nothing and took thousands of more lives. It produced images that are some of the most frightening of all time. Those who fell from the greatest heights experienced the worst horror of that day. A vision of hell, those who hit the ground had their humanity erased. Ultimately, we can view September 11th as the inaugural event of the 21st century, with the image of the falling man hurtling toward the earth serenely, portraying the ideal of the existentialist.